The first sign that the world had ended was not the screaming. It was the silence that came just before it. A silence so complete that it felt unnatural, as if the entire city had taken a single breath and forgotten how to exhale. And in that strange suspended stillness, every familiar sound vanished one by one. The distant hum of traffic, the television from the apartment next door, the constant low electrical murmur of a modern world that had never once imagined it could go dark. Then came the sound, a wet, broken breathing, not outside, not in the street, right behind the door. You froze, because something in that sound was wrong. It was human, but only in the same way a corpse still resembles the person it used to be, a terrible imitation of life that had already begun to rot from within. Then came the scratching, slow, deliberate, like fingernails dragging across wood. At first you thought it was your neighbor. Then you remembered your neighbor had left for work 3 hours ago. The knocking started next. 3 soft taps, then silence, then 3 more. And with every second that passed, the apartment itself seemed to shrink around you, the walls pressing inward as the thing on the other side of the door continued to breathe in short, ragged pulls, as though every inhale was an act of violence. This was not panic. Panic comes later. This was the moment the mind still tries to explain what it is hearing. A sick person, a drunk, a prank, anything except the truth. Then your phone buzzed. No service. 1 bar. Then none. The screen flickered. Emergency broadcast. Stay indoors. Do not approach infected individuals. Avoid direct contact. The message vanished before you could finish reading it. And then from somewhere below, a scream tore through the stairwell. Not one scream, many, a layered chorus of terror rising through concrete like smoke from a fire. The thing outside your door stopped scratching for 1 second. Then it slammed into the wood hard enough to rattle the frame. That was the moment you understood. The world had not ended. It had entered something worse. It had awakened. And somewhere in the city, beneath stone older than the roads above it, something ancient had begun to move. The first hour of the outbreak belongs to confusion. That is how it spreads. Not through speed, through disbelief. People die because they spend too long trying to understand what they are seeing. The woman in the hallway, wearing her office heels when she stumbled toward the elevator, one shoe missing, her white blouse stained dark across the shoulder, her breathing frantic and shallow. She was still alive. At least she looked alive. Then she turned. Her eyes were wrong. The pupils had widened until almost nothing remained of the iris, leaving 2 dark pools fixed on the young man trying to help her. And before he could even speak, she lunged with a force no injured body should possess. He screamed once, only once, because when she tore into his throat, the sound ended in a wet, choking gasp that sprayed the walls behind him. And then came the first impossible thing. He got back up. Too fast, far too fast. Not injured, not dying, changing. His body convulsed once violently, and when he raised his head, the expression was already gone. No fear, no pain, only hunger. Within minutes, the corridor had become a feeding ground. Doors opened. People looked out. People ran. People died. The city was still trying to call it a riot, still trying to call it an incident, still pretending language could soften what was happening. But beneath the panic, another truth was moving. Something older than disease, because not all of the infected moved the same way. Some dragged themselves. Others listened. And a few watched. Those were the ones you had to fear. The seers. The first reports described them as standing perfectly still in intersections and corridors, their heads tilted slightly to one side, as though listening to something no one else could hear. Then suddenly they moved. Not randomly, purposefully. Toward sound. Toward heartbeat. Toward life. And as night approached, survivors began to notice something even worse. The infected were not wandering. They were gathering, as if called, as if summoned, as if somewhere beyond the horizon there was a mind greater than their own pulling invisible strings through ruined flesh. That was when the rumors began. Whispers spreading faster than the outbreak itself. That this had not started in a hospital. That it had begun beneath the Vatican. Inside a sealed archive. Inside a chamber never meant to be opened. A chamber containing something older than plague. Older than science. Blood. Ancient blood. The blood of Soren. Night changes everything. During the day, terror is visible. At night, terror becomes imagination. And imagination is always worse. The city darkened faster than anyone expected. One district lost power, then another. Then the skyline itself began to vanish. Tower by tower, until the world outside became a landscape of black silhouettes and distant fires. The silence returned. Only now it was broken by movement. Not running. dragging hundreds of feet scraping asphalt, a slow migration of the dead. By midnight, the streets below had become rivers of bodies. But the infected were no longer alone. That was when the first witness reports came in. Figures moving above the streets, not among the hordes. Above them, on rooftops, in windows, watching. Tall silhouettes with eyes that reflected moonlight like polished glass. The old legends were returning, not as stories, as predators. For centuries, the vampire bloodlines had survived by remaining unseen. But now the rules had changed. The masquerade was over. To them, the outbreak was not a catastrophe. It was opportunity. A world in chaos is easier to rule. A city consumed by fear is easier to harvest. And the dead below, mindless and ravenous, served a purpose. They cleared the weak. They drove survivors into hiding. They softened the world for what was coming next. Because the infected were not the final horror. They were the first wave. The failed. The rejected. The husks left behind by an experiment that had gone terribly wrong. The true threat had not yet revealed itself. Somewhere in the darkness, the bloodline that created them was waking. And it was hungry. By the time dawn began to stain the horizon, the city no longer belonged to the living. Smoke rose from entire districts. Cars sat abandoned at impossible angles, shop windows shattered, apartment doors hanging open. And everywhere silence, too much silence, the kind that makes survival feel temporary. You looked down into the street. The infected had retreated into the shadows of alleys and underground stations, avoiding the first rays of morning light, their unstable bodies recoiling from the ultraviolet burn. But something remained. A single figure standing in the middle of the road. Still, perfectly still. Not infected, not human. A man dressed in black. Watching the building. Watching you. Even from several floors above, you could feel the weight of his gaze. Then he smiled, and that smile carried something ancient inside it. Recognition. He knew you were there. He had known all night. The figure raised one hand slowly and pointed toward the eastern district, where the skyline had split open with fire. A tower. Burning. At its summit, something moved against the dawn. Wings. Massive. Unnatural. Then came the message. Broadcast across every device still alive. One line. One sentence. One truth. Soren has returned. And beneath that message, another. Day one begins now. By the time the second night settled over the ruined skyline, the city no longer looked like civilization. What had once been alive with light, movement, and human voices had become a carcass of concrete and smoke. The streets were empty. Ordinary life was gone. In its place, shapes moved slowly through the darkness. They carried the dreadful certainty of hunger. Every surviving window had become an eye. Every locked door felt like a heartbeat waiting to be discovered. And every shadow seemed to hide something older than the outbreak itself. What made the darkness unbearable was not only the infected, it was the growing realization that they were changing. They no longer moved like mindless creatures driven by instinct alone. As the hours passed, survivors watching from rooftops, stairwells, and shattered apartment windows began to notice the same terrifying pattern. The hordes were not wandering at random. They were converging. Slowly, deliberately, almost with ritual precision. All of them were moving toward the eastern district, toward the tower that had burned through the dawn. Its upper floors still pulsed with an unnatural crimson light. The glow could be seen from miles away, like the ember of some monstrous furnace buried deep inside the heart of the city. But beneath that tower, deeper than the sewer lines, and older than the city's foundations, there was another city, a hidden city, one almost no living human had ever seen, and fewer still had survived to describe. It was a labyrinth of tunnels, crypts, abandoned transit shafts, plague chambers, forgotten catacombs. Over centuries, it had expanded into something far worse, an underground kingdom, a place whispered about in Vatican archives as the lower vein. According to the oldest sealed texts, this was where the first blood rituals had been performed, where the earliest attempts to merge immortality with flesh had taken place, and where the name Soren first entered the history of terror. It was here that the surviving broadcasts began to point. One emergency frequency, somehow still alive amid the collapse of the grid, repeated the same coordinates every 7 minutes. A whisper of static, a pulse of fear, breaking through the silence. The message said, "If you are alive, do not remain above ground after sunset. The infected are being drawn below." Something is calling them, the message repeated, again and again. Then on the third loop, a new line appeared. It is not the dead you should fear tonight. That sentence alone forced the remaining survivors into a choice. The city above had become a slow death. But the city below promised something far worse. Still, people moved toward it, driven by desperation, by the need for answers. Because even the most horrifying truth felt better than ignorance. And in the darkness beneath the streets, something was waiting. The first people to descend into the lower vein did not do so out of bravery. They went because the world above had left them no choice. One by one, small groups of survivors moved through maintenance hatches, collapsed metro entrances, and broken service tunnels. They carried flashlights, improvised weapons, and the last fragments of hope. Some still believed there might be a military safe zone below, a hidden medical containment zone, a place untouched by the nightmare above. But the moment they crossed beneath the old storm drains, every illusion of rescue began to dissolve. The walls were wrong. Not simply old, wrong, layered in a way that felt unnatural, as if centuries of architecture had been built over something far older, and then swallowed by time. Beneath the concrete was stone. Beneath the stone were carvings, symbols etched so deeply that even erosion had failed to erase them. Circular sigils, lines like veins, like roots, all of them converging toward the same emblem. A crown above a drop of blood. Some survivors thought it was a cult symbol. Others recognized it instantly, the crest of Soren. But what truly shattered them was not the symbol. It was the sound. At first it seemed distant, easy to mistake for machinery. A slow metallic rhythm echoing through the tunnels. Steady, but as they moved deeper, the truth became impossible to ignore. It was not mechanical. It was footsteps. Armored footsteps. Measured. Disciplined. Many of them. Then the corridor opened into an ancient vaulted chamber, and for the first time, the survivors saw what the old legends had failed to prepare them for. They stood in formation, row after row of figures in dark ceremonial armor, perfectly still, their faces pale, almost statuesque beneath high collars of black steel. Their eyes reflected the weak flashlight beams with a cold amber glow. There was no infection in them, no madness, only intelligence. Ancient, predatory. The room itself seemed to recoil from their presence. The First Legion. They had not returned to save the city. They had returned to claim it. At their center stood a figure taller than the rest. He wore a long black coat that moved as if the darkness itself clung to it. When he stepped forward, the survivors finally understood why history had buried his name in myth. Soren. He did not rush. He did not snarl. He simply looked at them. And in that gaze was a terrible calm, cold, aristocratic. The gaze of something that had watched empires rise and fall. To him, the end of the modern world was nothing more than the correction of an old inconvenience. Then he spoke. His voice moved through the chamber like cold smoke. The dead above are not the plague. A pause. Then, they are the consequence. With that single sentence, the horror deepened, because it revealed the truth every survivor had feared. This outbreak had not escaped. It had been unleashed. Soren led them deeper. Not as prisoners. Not yet. It felt more like they were witnesses. Invited to see a truth too terrible to remain hidden. The chamber beyond was older than the city itself. It looked like a subterranean cathedral. Its walls were lined with stone sarcophagi, each one marked with inscriptions in languages long extinct. At the center of the hall stood something far more unsettling. A massive cylindrical vessel made of black glass. Cracked along one side, its surface gleamed under the failing light. Inside, dark residue still clung to the walls. Wet, thick, almost alive. Soren looked toward it. Then he spoke. This is the origin. For centuries, the Vatican had preserved samples of the original bloodline, taken from the first rites of immortality. They believed it could be weaponized, purified, turned into something useful. Soldiers that could survive war, plague, even death itself. But instead, they created instability. The infected above were not zombies. Not in the simple sense. They were failed vessels, human bodies rejecting a bloodline too ancient to coexist with mortal flesh. Some decayed into the mindless hordes now roaming the streets. Others changed, evolved. Those became the seers, and a very small number became something far worse. Hybrids, still intelligent, still calculating, still capable of hunting with strategy instead of instinct. They did not feed only from hunger. They hunted with purpose. As Soren spoke, the ground beneath the cathedral began to tremble. Not violently, slowly, deliberately, like something enormous turning in its sleep far below the chamber. For the first time, even Soren's expression darkened. His voice lowered, almost to a whisper. There is another. A pause. Then, something older than the Legion, older than the Vatican experiments, older even than me. The survivors froze. Then the trembling came again, deeper this time, heavier, as if the city itself had begun to breathe. Soren's eyes lifted toward the darkness below, and then he said the words none of them were prepared to hear. It has awakened. A long silence, then one final sentence, because of the blood spilled across this city. The survivors did not understand what that meant. Not until the first scream came from below. It was not human. It was not infected. The sound was deep, distorted, so deep it seemed to rise from the earth itself, as if some impossible throat buried beneath layers of stone had finally found its voice. Then came the second tremor. This one was stronger, strong enough to split cracks across the cathedral floor. The stone beneath their feet began to fracture. From those cracks, a faint red glow started to rise, dim at first, then growing brighter, pulsing, breathing. One of the legionnaires stepped back, not because of the survivors, because of what lay beneath them. For the first time, fear crossed even the faces of the First Legion. Soren's voice dropped to a low whisper. The first experiment was never mine. Silence filled the chamber. Then came the truth. Before Soren, before the bloodlines, before the first vampires, there had been another attempt at immortality. Something far older, something the oldest text named only as the heart below, a living core of corrupted blood, buried beneath a city, kept dormant for centuries through ritual containment. The survivors stared at the widening cracks. Then the realization hit. The Vatican had not merely released the plague. They had broken the seal. The infected hordes above were only feeding it. Every death, every bite, every drop of blood spilled into the streets. All of it flowed downward, toward the heart. The red light beneath them pulsed stronger. With every second it grew brighter, more alive. The cracks widened. The cathedral trembled. Then Soren turned toward the survivors, his eyes cold, his voice grave, and he said the words that transformed the apocalypse into something infinitely worse. If it rises before dawn, a pause, then the dead will no longer be the hunters. For one terrible moment, everything went silent. Then the floor beneath them split open. A massive rupture tore across the chamber. Stone collapsed into the darkness below, and from the crimson light, something moved. The moment the cathedral floor split apart, every illusion of control collapsed with it. What opened beneath them was not just a crack in stone. It was a wound, a jagged crimson fissure descending into the earth. It looked less like broken architecture, and more like flesh being torn open from the inside. Below it was an abyss, so deep that the weak emergency lights could not reach the bottom. From its depths, a slow red glow began to rise, pulsing, breathing. Each wave of light moved through the chamber with the sickening rhythm of a heartbeat. A massive one, so powerful that the very columns trembled in response, as if the city above had unknowingly been built atop the chest cavity of something ancient, something still alive. For a long, unbearable moment, no one moved. Fear had become something deeper than panic, something colder, more instinctive, the kind of terror that settles directly into the body, locking muscles, slowing breath, forcing the mind to confront a horrifying truth. That reality itself might only be the thin upper layer of a far older nightmare. Then the sound came again, a heartbeat, not a metaphor, not a symbol. A real cavernous thud rising from below, strong enough to shake dust from the ceiling. Loose fragments of stone skittered toward the edge of the chasm. One of the survivors, a young man pale with exhaustion, took an involuntary step back. His voice barely a whisper. "What is that?" Soren did not answer at first. Instead, he moved closer to the fissure. He looked down into the red-lit abyss, and for the first time since entering the lower vein, something changed in his expression. Not surprise, not confusion, recognition, memory. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries. A pause. It was the first thing that ever tried to become immortal. Silence fell over the chamber. The words settled like frost. Before the legions, before the vampire bloodlines, before the infected had ever staggered into the streets, there had been something else. An earlier ritual, an older experiment, not created by scientists, not by priests, not by kings, but by something far more desperate. The first civilization that looked at death and decided it was unacceptable. The survivors stared into the abyss. The red glow pulsed brighter. The heart below. Not a machine. Not an organism in any way modern science could understand. A core. A convergence. A living mass of corrupted blood and ancient consciousness. Buried beneath centuries of stone. Hidden by centuries of secrecy. Sustained by rituals so old that even Soren remembered them only in fragments. And now, after centuries of dormancy, it was feeding. Every death in the city. Every infected bite. Every body collapsing in the streets above. All of it flowed downward. The outbreak had never been random. It had been nourishment. A harvest. The first thing to emerge from the chasm was not what anyone expected. It was not a beast. Not a monster in the conventional sense. It was a hand. A human hand. At least, it looked like one. Pale, elongated, wet with dark fluid that clung to the fingers in thick, viscous strands. Slowly it gripped the broken edge of the fissure. Its nails scraped across the stone. The sound echoed through the chamber. Sharp, unnatural. And the moment it did, every legionnaire moved into formation. Perfect discipline. Perfect synchronization. That alone revealed something horrifying. They had prepared for this. This was not an unknown threat. This was the thing their entire bloodline had feared returning. Then the figure began to pull itself upward. At first it seemed almost human, a silhouette draped in shadow, its body slick with crimson residue. But as more of it emerged, the horror became clear. Its limbs were too long, its proportions wrong, its joints bent at angles no human body should allow. Then came the face, or what should have been a face. It looked unfinished, as if flesh and memory could not agree on what shape it should take. A smooth, almost featureless mask. Only two dark hollows stared outward. Empty. Watching, the survivors recognized it instantly. Not by appearance, by the way it moved. This was the origin of the seers. The prototype. The first failed, but unlike the mindless creatures above, this one was aware. Its head turned slowly, not toward the survivors, toward Soren. Then it smiled. Or rather, the smooth surface of its face split open, a thin vertical opening, stretching wider and wider, far beyond what any human jaw should ever allow. Then it spoke. "You came back." Its voice did not come from a mouth. It came from everywhere. The walls, the floor, the bloodline symbols carved into the stone, as if the chamber itself had learned to speak. Soren's expression hardened. Then he answered, "I came to end what was started." For a moment there was silence. Then the thing laughed, a sound like wet bone cracking. Then the chamber erupted. More hands burst from the fissure. Then bodies, dozens of them, clawing upward from the crimson light below. The first generation of the failed, preserved beneath the city for centuries. Now rising, a grotesque tide of half-human forms. Their movements were fast, calculated, intelligent, exactly as Soren had warned. These were not zombies. These were hunters. And they had been waiting beneath the city for centuries. What followed no longer resembled survival. It became war. The First Legion moved within human speed. Their black armor caught the crimson light pulsing from below. For the survivors, this was the first true glimpse of what the old world had been protected from for centuries. The old legend suddenly felt incomplete. This was not myth. This was ancient violence, disciplined, precise, terrifying. The legionnaires moved like shadows given intent. Blades flashed in arcs too fast for the eye to follow. Limbs fell. Heads rolled across the stone. Every strike landed with deadly precision. But for every failed that fell, two more clawed their way out of the abyss. Worse still, they were changing. Their movements became faster, more coordinated, as if the heart below was learning in real time. That was the true horror. It was adapting. Then Soren moved. He descended into the center of the chamber like a living storm. His coat flowed around him in waves of darkness. Every strike carried the force of centuries of war. He did not fight with rage. He fought with terrifying efficiency, but even he could not stop the flow. The survivors were forced back against the cathedral walls. Above them, the city trembled. The hordes in the streets had begun to converge, all of them moving toward the tower, toward the cathedral, toward the heart, drawn by the same pulse now shaking the earth. Then came the revelation that changed everything. One of the survivors looked through the widening fissure. Far below, shapes moved in the red light. Not more failed, something larger. Massive silhouettes circling the heart below. Winged, ancient. The first vampires, older than Soren's legion, older than the bloodlines above. Buried with the heart for centuries, guardians, or prisoners. At this point, the difference no longer mattered. Soren turned and saw them. For the first time, his composure broke. His expression darkened. Then he spoke, his voice low, almost to himself. If they rise, a pause, then the words that froze the chamber. Night will never end again. By what should have been dawn, the sky above the city remained black, not clouded, black, as if the horizon itself had been consumed. The heart below had reached the surface. Its pulse now rolled through the streets in visible waves of crimson light, turning shattered glass, smoke, and stone into reflections of something that no longer belonged to the natural world. The infected above had stopped hunting survivors. Instead, they stood motionless in intersections, alleyways and rooftops all facing the cathedral district, their bodies swaying in perfect synchronization with the pulse beneath the earth. The city had become one organism, one body, one heartbeat. Inside the cathedral, Soren stood at the edge of the chasm as the first winged shape began to rise from below, its silhouette unfolding against the red glow like some ancient nightmare returning from burial. The survivors looked upward. No sunrise, no light, only the spreading darkness. Then Soren spoke the words that transformed the apocalypse into a prophecy. This was never an outbreak, he said. It was a resurrection. The winged figure rose higher, and when its eyes opened, the entire chamber was flooded with a light so red it seemed to bleed into the stone itself. The first of the ancient ones had awakened, and somewhere far above, across every dead screen and every remaining emergency frequency, a single message appeared. Day 2, the reign of night.